I'm sure I don't need to introduce the man to my left. I am Svend Brown. I'm the artistic director of the halls here, though not recently enough to have participated in the creation of this wonderful event, which brings together so many of the partners working in music in Glasgow to celebrate the music of a composer who not only is a composer but as a thinker, as an educationist, in so many different roles, has had a dramatic impact on Scottish music over the past 40 years, actually, which is a scary thought in some way. Festival director, you name it, it's all there in the mix. And what we're going to do tonight is to talk for about 20 minutes or so, focusing quite strongly on the Fourth Symphony, but on whatever else comes up, and then open the floor to yourselves for questions. When it comes to questions, if you just raise your hands in the time-honored manner, and we'll take as many as we've got time for. But when we were just standing outside, we were both reflecting on the fact that this piece that we're going to hear tonight, the Fourth Symphony, was written for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra for the proms, in fact, wasn't it? So it was a piece for a huge auditorium, but for the smallest orchestra to date that you had written a symphony for. There had been other pieces called Sinfonietta or whatever else, but this was the first symphony for chamber orchestra forces. And a lot of the comment at the time centered on the fact that you were working with scant resources in a way, but not sacrificing any of the symphonic thought. Now that you've written the subsequent symphonies, could you give us a sense of how you feel this piece falls in the works you've completed to date?
I think that this symphony, number 4, is very much the central symphony of the set of 7, if you want to include the Antarctic Symphony, which is really a tone poem. It is the central set of the main 7, the central piece. And in many ways, because it's for chamber orchestra, I had the luxury of writing the most concentrated. I think number 5, I borrowed some of those techniques which I'd learnt from this symphony and extended them for a large orchestra, but this one, it is very, very concentrated, and probably in many respects the toughest for the players and the audience because of that extreme concentration.
And it's not a concentration in time terms, is it? Because it's actually a substantial work. It's 45 minutes?
I don't know how long it is, I've forgotten. It seems to me to last about 10 minutes, but then you know what composers are like.
But in common with several of your larger chamber works, it takes a continuous span of music, but within that creates a classical structure, effectively, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite a complex form. I was really experimenting with the architecture in this piece in a way I hadn't done in any of the symphonies. And I think even on a first hearing, it's very clear that there are contrasts, there are different layerings, there are whole ways of thinking about both the layering that way and the layering that way, which are quite unusual. And my goodness, this showed at the time. It had a very strange birth, this piece. It was commissioned by Salveson, and I remember being very discouraged because there was a dinner at the Sheraton Hotel in Edinburgh where I had to go and be nice to these various Salveson people. And I remember one of them, who must have been very high up in the firm, who said, "I hope you're not going to give us something awful like that Schoenberg stuff." So I said, oh, certainly not, sir. It would be much worse. And so it proved. And it was very difficult because there I wrote this piece which, all right, it strained me to the utmost to write it. The concentration was quite extraordinary. And then to actually stand in front of the SCO and conduct it. Well, I'm no conductor and I found it quite tough. Ollie is a very good conductor, he can do it. But I found it very tough. And I think it was interesting that I had written things for the SCO before, but on this occasion they made it quite clear that they didn't like the piece and thought that I'd gone off my head, which is very understandable. And I do remember that first performance at the Albert Hall. It was not satisfactory because I had written the piece thinking, well, this is a piece for a chamber orchestra, and all right, it's going to have some quite loud brass in it, a couple of trumpets and a couple of horns, but I'm not going to compromise the nature of chamber music and make it try to speak out in that way. Think of the hall in Glasgow, the hall in Edinburgh, where it will be played later. Or think of the recording. And so, in the Albert Hall, it didn't really sound all that wonderful. And I was very conscious of that from the start. In fact, on that programme, I think I was conducting a Mozart piano concerto, and he enjoyed that much more than my own piece. But I think that it was a tough piece. The audience made it very clear it didn't like it, and afterwards, I think Salversons at the reception made it very clear that they didn't either. I remember my party was stuck at this table and right at the end of the room, and some Salverson representative was overheard to say, well, down there, the unimportant people. Well, I took that rather badly. And I think that with the reaction that I had and so on, I haven't really thought about this piece. It has been done a few times. It was done in France. God knows what that must have been like with a French orchestra 10 years ago. But I really came back to it just recently when I read it again, and then I lost my score and couldn't find it. And so I came here without a score, and I heard it in the hall here, and I thought, yes, I can perfectly well understand why this piece went down so badly 20 years ago, with the players, with the audience, and with the sponsors who paid for it. The sponsors, by the way, I think the next year they got a Jimmy Macmillan piece, which, God bless Jimmy, it was an instant success. My piece was certainly not, and I think the next year they would have had a much better time of it. But coming back to it, I thought, yes, this is a difficult piece, but my God, it was worth it. It says exactly, these days with the orchestra being so good, and they can do all those rhythms and do all those extraordinary things that I asked them to do 20 years ago without effort, because they played so much more new music. And with Ollie conducting, it just is so clear. And at the rehearsal, I had very little to say to Ollie, except thank you, that was very, very good. And I feel that possibly tonight and tomorrow in Edinburgh, the piece will come to life for the very first time in a way which, at that first performance and subsequently, I was so discouraged I thought it never would. I thought perhaps I really have made a mistake here.
Extraordinary, isn't it? And part of that, I suppose, was purely and simply venue in the end.
In the end, the venue at the Albert Hall, but also the reaction of orchestra, audience, and critics, and Salverson, and so on and so on. I don't think anybody liked it at all, except Ollie Nusson.
Well, can we talk a bit about the issue of difficulty in that case? Because you have never been... Well, there are two things that as somebody in my chair loves about you. One is that you talk very well, but the other one is actually the program notes that accompany your pieces are almost invariably a combination of a bit of a tease of various insights and gobbets of information, and actually quite a lot left for you just to get on with on your own. And I know you last night in yesterday's pre-concert talk, you talked quite a bit about the demands that you make on an audience,
yes,
and that you feel that you have a right to make on the audience, and that's absolutely fine. But I'm just interested to what extent you feel in the time since '89, say, that you have met the audience more halfway, not by dumbing down in any sense, but by providing more audible oral clues, I suppose, to structure and so forth?
I think it depends on the piece. I think that piece last night, it's as concentrated as anything. But with a big orchestra like that, you probably have a better chance with the doublings of hearing what's going on more clearly. And also, the colours, I think, are of a different sort in that you've got a huge palette. I've written, particularly in the years I was working with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, quite a few pieces which have been much lighter, like the MacDonald Dances, the Spell for Green Corn, which I remember the SCO playing, and I've done it, and it gets done an awful lot. The Orkney Wedding with Sunrise gets done everywhere, and those are the pieces which I think I'm quite well known for in that world, and I think people are quite shocked when they come and hear a symphony sometimes. I do remember another occasion at the Royal Albert Hall when I conducted my second symphony with the BBC Phil from Manchester, and that must be more than 20 years ago, and even then quite a lot of the audience walked out. Well, these days you do that piece and nobody bats an eyelid. It's just okay, nobody worries.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the background to this particular piece then. There are two very, very clear starting points which you elucidate in your own writing about it. One is your encounter with an eagle. The
Yes.
other is this particular chant.
Yes. I think the drama of the chant, and that it's a peace chant, which I think particularly these days is even more relevant than it was 20 years ago with the invasions that the British have indulged in recently, of which I think it's no secret I disapprove violently, if I can use that word in that context. That here there was something which was ritualized drama, and that's something which I feel very strongly is part of the drama of a symphony, that it is a ritual, it has to be dramatic, it goes through certain paces, and I related it to that plain song and the whole feel of that plain song. And the other image, the eagle, well, I'll never forget that. I was at home on Hoy, and I got up very, very early, and just a few yards away, about as far as the end of the room there on the garden post was this golden eagle. And I opened the door, and this thing just looked at me with great disdain, and then these enormous wings opened, and it took off. And I will never forget the image. And at the opening of this piece, with the brass, I don't think you can describe it in music, and I haven't even tried, but there is something of the impression of that moment, which was just one of those moments you never, ever, ever forget. And it was just so vivid, so wonderful. And I think it does inform the work. That, for me, all right, I'm prejudiced, I'm a composer, but something of the sheer, again, ritual magic of that moment in the dawn, against the sunrise, it was just wonderful.
And coming back to the chant, and also the question of the structure, so you have a sonata form, and then a scherzo, then an adagio, and then the finale.
Yes.
Running continuously. But all the time you are traducing that, aren't you?
Yes, it's always undermined because it does something else. There are always transformations happening, that the actual texture splits or is undercut, and there are side issues or digressions or subclauses, which I think in the first instance made the piece so hard to listen to. I don't think that is the case anymore. I think people can cope. We'll find out tonight, but I think people can cope with that much more willingly. Exactly why, I don't know. Perhaps something in those 20 years, in the way people think music out, composers really think about their processes, that it's made that more easy to think. I really don't know.
Do you think that one of the aspects that has become easier for listeners is the concept of balancing different timescales happening all at the same time, simultaneously? Because
Yes, I do. I think that people can relate different textures which are functioning in different times more readily than they did. And I think that the modality of this piece the centering on C right at the beginning, I think it's much clearer. And even this afternoon, the orchestra were playing that very clearly. Ollie was conducting it very clearly. I asked him just to slow down a bit, to make the modal tonal point a bit more at that point. But I think that people are not having so much difficulty hearing some kind of harmonic logic through the work, which they certainly did 20 years ago. And I think I was right out there on the far end of some kind of very remote island writing this piece then. But I think it's wonderful to get to this age and you hear something like that, and it's not giving people the same kind of difficulty that it did when you wrote it.
You've written a complete cycle of symphonies, obviously, and they span many decades. And clearly it was a central part of your work. There are plenty of your contemporaries who've not written a single symphony. What do you think that says about, I mean, it is the old state of the symphony question. What is the state of the symphony? What is the role of the symphony for a composer now?
I think the symphony is what you make it. I do remember when I wrote my very first, the writer on music, Hans Keller, wrote a very long article. I think it was in Tempo, the music magazine, proving that my symphony wasn't a symphony. And I loved and respected Hans tremendously, but his reason for that was that it didn't have traditional German development sections. It had transformations of material rather than the splitting up and reassembling of the material, which happens in a Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert symphony, or a Tchaikovsky symphony, or anything since. It didn't do that. It did something else. But they all do that. And I think my reason for writing symphonies, one of my reasons for writing symphonies, is that they have opened up the possibility of writing large time spans full of music, where transformation of material, not in the traditional sense, chopping up and reassembling of material, developmental changes, are the rule of the day. And it has enabled me, particularly with some of the slow changes of contour, to be very conscious that I'm working sometimes on simultaneous, short, medium, and very long time spans, so that as in classical music, where the vanishing point of your tonic gives a focal point for the whole tonal spectrum of a piece, here you can have some kind of focus in time between things happening at different layers through, not their tonality, but I would say their modality, and through the relationship of time happening at various speeds, which is, if you like, a development of the late medieval, early Renaissance practice of isorhythmic techniques, where a section lasts so long, then it lasts less, and then it lasts less as the tempo squashes and becomes faster. And you can actually superpose those through techniques, medieval techniques, which I won't go into, but which influenced me a lot. And I think out of that, by the time I got to this symphony, I was doing something more radical with it than I'd ever done before. One of the things I really, really felt was a breakthrough for me was at the time of the First Symphony, thinking of the tenor voice in its original sense, the voice which holds long notes. The notes are tenuto, they're held. It's not just a question of that particular register, but they are held, and that's where your plain song was, of course. And you can use that as a focal point and write material above and below it, as the medieval composers did, writing modally, and it does make you perceive your harmony in a completely different and modal way, rather than thinking up from a bass. And I think people are more prepared, without knowing it at all, to do that in a piece like this particular symphony.
Just one last question from me before we open up to the floor, which is, having said all of that about the various directions which converged in these works,
yes.
and I'd be interested to press you more a little about how what you described as your symphonic process and the disappearing point of tonality and these different processes working over a huge span of music differs from, say, Taverner, where you have the revelation of the innomine at the end, but actually you've been coming to that point for 2 hours.
Yes, I have. In Taverner, in the opera, it's in D minor right from the start, although you don't know it for a long way, and then it becomes it more and more, and it becomes D minor right at the end. So does Wozzeck. Which I think is purely coincidental, but it is a piece which has been a huge influence. These time spans and making the ear go on a journey through modalities or tonalities, it perhaps is a game, and I think one game, particularly in these symphonies that I have played, is to take the accepted tonal structure which we all know and put against that, so that that is in the background, what I am doing, so that sometimes you hear, quite literally, a substitute dominant, which might not be a dominant, it's somewhere else. Another degree of the scale. But you have to have, I think, the education to know what's behind it.
Sure. Just want to open it up to the floor, and if you don't have any questions, I've got plenty more, but I'd be delighted to see if we can... Sir. Stuart, yeah.
You mentioned transformation processes in your symphonic works. I wonder if there's a distinction between the way that you use these sorts of processes in the symphonies as opposed to tone poems, and if there's something special about the way you use transformation processes as kind of development substitution. It's not there in the tone poem works.
It's there in both. I was doing the MacDonald Dance's Spell for Green Corn last week in Salzburg with the Salzburg Camerata. And I did make a point there of saying that the transformation processes in that relate very directly to Last Door of Light, a piece which they had commissioned and which I was conducting with the orchestra last week. I did it last year, but not in Salzburg, in Ossiach and Villach at the Corinthian Summer Festival. And it's, I think, very audible and takes a long time through the whole work in those, well, they are quite popular dances. And in something like the Orkney Wedding with Sunrise, it's there too, but I think on another kind of level, whereas in something like this Fourth Symphony, it's happening very intensely and constantly, and you have to be pretty damn smart. But, as you full well know, when you're listening to a Beethoven symphony, you don't have to be aware of all the processes that are going on. In the Third Symphony, I think I'm one of the few people who is aware in the development of that, how that tune is prefigured before it comes, when it arrives in E minor, and all the analysts say, oh, this is a new tune, this is Beethoven breaking all the laws in an E-flat symphony, having a new tune in E minor in the middle of the development. It isn't a new tune, and he's prepared it very carefully through a transformation process, not a developmental process, interestingly enough. But people don't know that. You don't expect them to. And I think in some of these pieces of mine, you don't expect them to. First of all, you hope that they're going to enjoy it. And the textures and the excitement and the colours and perhaps just the sheer storminess or the calm or the contrast and those things. And perhaps a composition student might come to those other things, but it's not necessary for anybody else, although I love it if they do.
Any more from anyone?
It's very hard to say what triggers composition in the first place, because I think it exists on a level below your consciousness before you know it, because sometimes things appear and they're totally and absolutely complete. For instance, today at the Royal Scottish Academy, one of the students played Farewell to Stromness, piano piece I read a long time ago. And that just arrived, and I wrote it down like that and didn't change a note. It was just there. So I think it must have been under the threshold for quite a long time. And I know that I take long walks and think about ideas, really do, very constructively think about the architecture and the harmony and where it's going and the rhythms before I write anything down. But something like the opening of this symphony with the Golden Eagle, you think about that image and somehow it gradually seems to get this aura of music around it, and then you listen to it very intensely and it crystallizes out. And I remember the very first symphony I wrote. There was a day when I was walking at the bottom of the cliffs and the sea was just crashing against them and setting up all these overtones, which the wind was in such a direction that they were very, very vivid. And that set off the beginning of that. But it took me probably about a week to figure out what that musical image was, just from the raw element that I had in my head for a start. So it really is very hard to say. And I think I can only honestly say, I can give you an idea, but I can't really define it.
Having said that, in that context, if you're talking about a long process of gestation and thought, there are two sources which recur and recur and recur, one of which is chant, obviously, yes. And the other one actually is symbols and ideas. As a composer, I don't think I know a piece of yours that doesn't have symbols and ideas worked into at different levels. At what point does a kind of knowing use of symbols and ideas meld with this ongoing process? Or can you not answer that? I mean,
I find that hard to answer because I do read a lot, and I suppose I think a lot, and you're always thinking about philosophical ideas, or this idea, or a literary idea, or a poetical idea, or you're inspired by an artist, or just an image which you haven't seen for a long time. Recently going to Rome, I was very aware, for instance, of Borromini's architecture, which I hadn't thought of in that very intense way since I was a student there. And lo and behold, there was a string quartet based on Borromini's architecture. It's very hard to say exactly when I stop thinking about the one and start thinking about the other, because they're in layers like that, and I think they cross all the time.
So your works must surprise you all the time?
I think so. Yes, I think at night I read in bed every evening, and of course, whatever you read, there are musical ideas from what you're working on earlier that day and thinking towards the future. And I remember the Seventh Symphony particularly came out of reading in German, I don't think he's translated yet, Hans Henny Jahn, who is an exact contemporary of Thomas Mann and wrote a book about a composer at exactly the time that Thomas Mann was writing about Adrian Leverkühn. But Thomas Mann was living in America and Hans Henny Jahn was living, I think, in Denmark at that time, not Norway. He spent a lot of time in Norway, trying to get out of the eyes of the Nazis who didn't approve of him. But I remember reading that, and it influenced that symphony tremendously.
We've got time for one more question, sir.
You might split your views on foreign policy. I wonder to what extent that's part of your music, or is it
It's been very much part of the music. Together with Andrew Motion, I wrote a piece to celebrate the life of the last surviving soldier from the First World War trenches who died recently at the age of 110, Harry Patch. And that, of course, was also, on behalf of Andrew Motion and myself, a protest against certain things that have happened recently in British foreign policy. And even in one of the string quartets, number 3, when the invasion of Iraq happened, and I'd been right at the front of that march in London, in front of 1 million people, protesting about that. We didn't know when that march happened that the decision to invade Iraq had already been taken, together with Bush, that the sheer anger erupted into the music. And as I said in a talk here this morning to the conference that is taking place, that We know full well that the likes of Bush and Blair, they would never listen to a Haydn quartet, never mind one by me, but I think part of a composer's function is to bear witness, as well as he or she can, about what happens. And that was something I felt absolutely passionately about, and there it is in that piece. And that is my reaction, an honest reaction. And we know that these politicians, they will take absolutely no notice. How could they? They're too ignorant. They've got no culture whatsoever, neither the Tories nor the Labour Party. They're totally unenlightened. Look, Ministry for Culture, Sport and Media. Everyone else has a Minister of Culture, not here. And I think one has to bear witness to that as well as one can, and the anger has to be expressed. Otherwise, I think I'd go crackers.
Well, on that note, would you join me in thanking Sir Peter Maxwell Davies? Thank you.